Hi everyone and welcome to the tutorial. Today I'm going to be demonstrating how to work felted joins. This technique is also called spit splicing. The principle is that we're going to take liquid and friction to join two ends of our yarn together. One of my least favourite jobs in knitting is when I get to the end of a project and I have to weave in all the ends of yarn that are left over from where I needed to change from an old ball of yarn that had run out to a new ball of yarn. If you can instead use felted joins wherever this is happening with the same colour of yarn in the same dye lot, which is consistent, so you don't need to alternate your yarns to blend them in together, then you're going to significantly minimise how many ends there are to weave in at the end, and you're going to save yourself a lot of time in the process. It's also really fun being able to take a broken piece of yarn and magically transform it into an unbroken continuous piece of yarn. So I hope you enjoy this technique as much as I do. Let's talk briefly about what yarns you can use with felted joins. And the answer is it depends. Generally, yarns that can felt are animal protein based yarns. So we're talking things like wool and alpaca. However, that doesn't mean that you can only use 100% animal protein based yarns with this technique. The yarn that I'm using today is 75% wool and then 15% net fibre, which I believe is nylon, and 10% bamboo. So generally, if you're using acrylic or plant fibre based yarns, those yarns will not felt to themselves. But if you're using a blend of those fibres with wool, you may find that the yarn can felt to itself. As in the case here, I know that I can definitely felt these ends together because I've done it successfully many times with this exact yarn. You also need to be careful if you're using a superwash wool yarn. Superwash treatment is where chemicals are applied to the yarn which removes all of the scales that the wool has, like our hair follicles do. But those scales are what you need to help you felt the yarn to itself. It helps the two ends of yarn to grip to each other. I do know that some people have had success with felting superwash yarns to itself. I think that greatly depends though on the specific base that you're using. If a yarn hasn't been as heavily superwash treated as another, you may find that yarn can felt. But personally, when I've tried this technique with superwash yarns, I haven't yet had any luck. So basically, you just need to experiment with the yarn that you are using in your project and see if it can felt to itself. Take a small scrap of the yarn, cut it in two, and then see if you can rejoin that yarn to itself. And if you can, that's awesome. That means that you can use felted joins in your project. And if it can't, that's okay. When you get to the end of an old ball of yarn and you need to join a new one, you'll just leave tails of both of those yarns that you can then weave in at the end of your project. The first thing I'm going to do is unply each end of my yarn. So if you've ever done embroidery or cross stitch before, you'll probably be quite familiar with how you need to take your embroidery floss and untwist it so you separate it into the individual strands. The same principle is what we're going to be doing here. Our yarn is generally made up of multiple plies unless it's a single ply yarn, and that is what gives the yarn strength and can give it texture as well. So we're going to look at this end first, and we can see that the yarn is twisting around itself this way. So if I twist it in the opposite direction, you can see that I begin to separate it into individual strands of yarn. So here I can see two distinct plies that make up my yarn. Now I like to split my yarn into at least 4 plies. I can't obviously see how I could do that with this. So what I'll do is halve each of these distinct plies, and that will give me 4 plies in total. So I'm just going to try to, as evenly as possible, split the strands of yarn that are making up that ply, and then come across to here, and again just try to, as evenly as possible, split this into 2, so I end up with 4 plies in total. And there we go. Now we'll do the same on the other side. So I'll untwist this yarn again to separate it into those 2 plies that I can see. And then we'll split each of these into 2. And I'm only separating and splitting out the yarn back about 2 centimeters or an inch into the tail of the yarn. So we just need a little bit split up. Okay, so the next thing is that I'm going to trim out half of the yarn on each of these ends. So when I join these 2 ends together, if I join them together in their current state, I'm going to end up with a total of 8 plies together. And if the original yarn only has 4 plies like this means I have double the thickness of yarn where the felted join was worked. So I'll end up with a blob in my yarn, and if I'm using a very smooth and consistent yarn like this, that's going to be quite obvious, so it's undesirable for me to do that. If I can halve out the yarn on each side, when I join them together I'll end up with 4 plies in total, which is what I have originally here in either this end or this end by itself. So that'll be the same equivalent number of plies as what I have in the rest of the yarn, and therefore I won't be adding any bulk where the felted join is. So we're just going to take some scissors, and if I've got here, these 2 plies together made up 1 ply originally, and same over here, these 2 plies made up 1 ply originally. I like to personally cut 1 ply from each. I just feel like it gives me a stronger join in the end. So if I cut 1/2 of this ply out here, and again we're just going to cut back about 1 centimeter or so, and then I'll cut out 1 ply from here. Then that end is done, and I'll cut out 1 ply from here, again about 1 centimeter back, and 1 ply from here. And we're just going to discard those little bits that have been trimmed off. So now we can see if we join or overlap these 2 ends together, we end up with 4 ends in total in that little spot. Now comes the really fun bit of this technique. We're going to do some felting to join these ends. So I mentioned at the start that this technique is also called spit splicing, and that's because you can literally spit on the yarn and use that liquid to do your felting. I have heard people say that the spit in our mouth actually has enzymes in it that will help the felting to be as strong as possible. So if you've ever had trouble with getting your ends to felt together properly, you might want to try spit and see if it works. Personally, I just always use water. So I'll grab just plain ordinary water from the tap like this, and I'll use that for my felting. So what I like to do, once I've overlapped the 2 ends together, I'll just pop the yarn in the palm of my hand like that, and then I'll dunk my finger in my water, and I'll just add a little bit of water at a time until I've thoroughly dampened the fibers of both ends of yarn. So I don't want it to be dripping wet, because then it will take a long time to dry, and that's a long time waiting to continue with my knitting project. So I just make sure it's damp like that, and I'm just wetting the spot where I've separated out the plies of the yarn. And now we're going to felt. So I'm going to put my 2 hands together, and I'm just going to start rubbing. And this is the friction that we need to felt the 2 ends of our yarn together. Now I'm just rubbing back and forth like this, so that I'm not separating out the ends of the yarn while I'm doing my felting. I'm just rolling them together basically. And you just rub and rub and rub until your 2 ends of yarn have joined together. So how long you need to add friction for will depend on your yarn. If it's quite a thick yarn, you might find it takes quite a while, and if it's a thin yarn, it might be a much quicker process. But I'll just rub for a bit, and then I'll test my join. I'll just pull the 2 ends of yarn away from each other very gently and slowly, and if I see any movement, like I saw a little bit of movement there, it means that my felting is not completely joined. So I'll go back and rub a bit more. If you need to add more water because you feel like the yarn has dried out, you can go ahead and do that. And I like to make sure if there's any fluffy bits, I try to sort of felt that bit out as well. I'll just do a little bit longer. Okay, this is looking pretty good. You can see, no trickery. This is where my two ends of yarn were separated, and I can now tug on them pretty firmly and they are joined. You can also see that the thickness of our yarn, it's a little bit squashed because it's been felted, but you can see that it's approximately as thick as the rest of our yarn. So when we did that trimming away of excess yarn, we prevented ourselves from getting any bulk there. Now it is noticeable where you've done your felted join. If you're really looking closely at your yarn, you can see that this yarn is felted and that this yarn is not. But once this gets knitted into your project, it'll be very hard to spot it, particularly if you're using a darker color of yarn. But that is how you work a felted join. Thank you so much for watching the tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe to our channel, and I'll see you soon for the next video.